Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Ash Sarkar, and I'm worried, Ash, because I know that I think this is going to be my last show with you for a little while because you're going on a book break. I said she doesn't need one. Don't let her take the time off. I need her every Monday, but apparently the higher ups have said that you strike a tough bargain. So how long are you going to be gone for?
Okay, so it's going to be 4 weeks where I'm not doing Novara live. But during that time, I'll still be recording if I speak. So you will be getting content out of me. I'll still be active on the company Slack, Michael. You'll never get me to log off. You just have to deal with someone much more informed than me every Monday. You won't just have me yapping, shooting straight off the top of the dome, forgetting the name of the Prime Minister.
I don't believe it. I mean, I haven't looked in our schedule. It could be someone without any expertise at all. I've got no idea, but hopefully it will be.
No, you've got some serious star power scheduled in.
Fantastic. I'll check it out after the show. Do you want to give a hint?
All I'll say is that it's GB News, but without, it's the same initials.
Oh, I get it. Yeah, that's clever. Good. That's pleasing. Well, what are we talking about tonight? Beginning the show with an interview. I'm talking about Europe's new security arrangements. Now that Donald Trump has said he doesn't want to protect us anymore. And in the second part of the show, we're going to talk about Luigi Mangione and the latest from Gaza. Donald Trump wanting to free a very nasty influencer. As the United States and Russia meet to discuss the future of Ukraine in Riyadh, European leaders have assembled in Paris to debate how they should respond to the United States' new confrontational approach to the continent. The meeting in Paris is an informal one, so the press haven't been invited inside, but leaders have been signalling their positions publicly over the weekend. And Keir Starmer's stance is perhaps the most dramatic. In an op-ed published in The Telegraph last night, Starmer said that the UK would be willing to send troops to Ukraine to serve as peacekeepers if a deal with the Russians was reached. This was the precise quote. So he said, "The UK is ready to play a leading role in accelerating work on security guarantees for Ukraine. This includes further support for Ukraine's military, where the UK has already committed £3 billion a year until at least 2030. But it also means being ready and willing to contribute to security guarantees to Ukraine by putting our own troops on the ground if necessary." Deploying troops is both risky and expensive, and the Sunday Times reported that Starmer was preparing to overrule his Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, to boost defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. Other European leaders have also been suggesting their stances on where their countries would stand when it comes to participating in any peacekeeping force. The Dutch Prime Minister has said he's not opposed to sending troops to guarantee any ceasefire, though he said it would also require US backing, which is in no way guaranteed, is it? Meanwhile, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said it would be premature to discuss any peacekeeping mission. He's up for re-election on the weekend and is very unlikely to remain Chancellor, so I suppose it makes sense for him to say that. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, though, has ruled out his country sending troops. Tusk has, though, wanted to highlight that Poland is spending more than its fair share in terms of defending Europe. So he tweeted this: "If we Europeans fail to spend big on defence now, we will be forced to spend 10 times more if we don't prevent a wider war. As the Polish PM, I'm entitled to say it loud and clear, since Poland already spends almost 5% of its GDP on defence, and we will continue to do so." So I suppose in a way mixed messages, isn't it? They won't send any troops as peacekeepers, but they do want to spend loads of money on defence. I suppose they're worried that they would maybe be next in line if Russia were to invade Poland, which no one, by the way, is really suggesting is on the cards. All this talk, of course, of increased defence spending will be music to the ears of Donald Trump, who's been calling for Europe to increase defence spending for over a decade now. And it's also music to the ears of Europe's defence companies. Shares in European arms manufacturers hit record highs this morning. Germany's Rheinmetall jumped 9.9%, while Britain's BAE Systems rose 7.3%, and France's Thales climbed 7%. Though all this spending might be a little late for Volodymyr Zelensky, who will be left on the sidelines as Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov meet in the Saudi capital.
Ukraine will not take part. Ukraine did not know anything about them. Ukraine regards any negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine as ones that have no result, and we cannot recognize any agreements made about us without us.
Речі або будь-які домовленості про нас без нас, і ми не будемо такі домовленості визнавати.
To discuss how Europe is responding to the new reality of Trump 2.0, I spoke earlier to a friend of the show, Paul Rogers. Paul is Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University, and I began by asking him what he made of Starmer's announcement that he'd be willing to send British troops to guarantee peace in Ukraine.
Difficult to say because we don't know what it involves and what he means by it. If he's talking about having British troops defending part of the Ukrainian border, then I think that's a very dangerous move. If he's talking about some sort of peacekeeping force, well, what sort of force? How big will it be? What countries will be involved? What is its purpose? Is it a UN-type peacekeeping force where you could have troops going both sides of a border? We simply know so little about it that I'd be very chary about saying what's at foot. If the principle is that we get some sort of deal which is acceptable to Ukraine and Russia, and presumably the United States, and if that deal involves the possibility of a stable transition to some sort of peace, then there may well be a case for having some sort of peacekeeping force. But whether that should be a Western peacekeeping force is a very different matter. I mean, traditionally on these things, you try and have people who are neutral in a particular conflict. So this is why there's so many uncertainties in it that I really find it very difficult to say, is this a good or bad thing? For the moment, at least, we may learn a little bit more later on. But if you take an example, supposing the case was to put in a brigade of British troops, fully capable in every sense, to guard a part of the frontier, the border between Ukraine and Russia, say a fifth of the entire border, because it's an extremely long border, then how long would that be expected to be there? Could the British Army cope with a full brigade taken out of its current mix for any length of time? What would happen if there was any sort of conflict developing out of it? Who would provide the air power? Who would provide even the naval power if it's down towards Crimea? There are so many uncertainties that you can't really say very much about it, except to say that if, that's a very big if, some sort of peace deal is done, which becomes acceptable to both sides, in broad terms, I think there should be a neutral country involvement rather than one of the leading members of NATO.
And I suppose, an example people might put forward to say it makes sense for it to be a NATO member or part of the Western alliance to be there is they look at Korea. So they say there was obviously this conflict between North and South Korea. South Korea has been able to sort of exist and continue as very much an independent nation because America has built so many military bases there, right? No one's going to try and invade South Korea. And maybe if you just had a few sort of United Nations peacekeepers, maybe from Ireland or sort of other neutral countries, it might be that the Ukrainians don't think that serves as a sufficient deterrence for them to, for example, I suppose, attract investment. What would you make of that sort of response?
Oh, I can see the case of the argument. I mean, it's a difficult one to sort of get some sort of different area. But from the point of view, look at it from Putin's point of view. If he ended up getting a ceasefire, which perhaps he didn't particularly like, but was more or less forced to accept, and then you had Western troops right up against essentially the Russian border, as they would be, then that Putin could use very much as another example of NATO encroaching on Russia, which has been his constant theme over the last, well, not just 3 years, over the last decade or so. So you've got that situation there. And of course, it would give him opportunities to sort of up the ante, not to any sort of war, sort of full-scale war, but keeping the troops on their toes the whole time. In other words, it plays into his hands, I think. And this is why I think it's different from what you were saying about North and South Korea. In this case, Russia would say, we now have NATO troops in what was previously a non-NATO country stationed right by our borders. And I'm telling you, Russians, this is essentially what I've been warning you about all along. The NATO is out to get us. Now, whether that's true or not is neither here nor there. The point is it can be sold as a particular idea. So you've got to move in some way in which he cannot do that. What that way is, who knows? But in broad terms, I always think that it's best in these cases to have some sort of group which is neutral as far as both sides are concerned. And this does not seem to be the way forward with that.
Do you think in order to keep the peace, I suppose, and avoid sort of any kind of much broader conflict, it's time for Europeans in the West, and potentially in the manner that Trump already has, to sort of accept that Ukraine is in Russia's sphere of influence, right? It's kind of their business what happens there, or do you think that would be a mistake to sort of go that far?
I think that would be a mistake to go that far. I mean, there are many things you can say about all of this. I mean, an awful lot of this goes back to what Putin has been able to do by convincing enough Russians that essentially the West is out to get them. And that goes back, he constantly refers to the longer term, because, of course, back in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union came apart at the seams, Russia embraced the Western economic model, in fact, turbo capitalism, many people called it, and it was a disaster failure. I mean, you had, was it about a third of all Russians were below the poverty line within a few years. But the more than that, I think we tend to forget this. Russia in the West, among Western militaries and politicians, was treated with a degree of contempt in the 1990s as a failed state. You know, this world power suddenly reduced to virtually nothing. And it was really something that many older Russians feel very bitter about even now. And Putin has been very skillful in catalyzing that, in getting his own support. And I think this is where you have to recognize, to tread with care, not to make it easier for him to actually get that kind of support. And I think this is where, if you do actually play into this hands of having a Western force there, then that will be one of the outcomes. It also means that if you have Western troops so close, there are all kinds of ways in which life could be made difficult for them without in any way risking an all-out war. And that, I think, the Russians will be pretty practiced at, or get practiced at it pretty quickly, and that will present another problem. So overall, I think it's upping the ante in doing this. It doesn't mean you have to accept that Ukraine is in Russian hands or in the Russian sphere of influence, but essentially we are where we are, and the geography is such that it is right next door. And other countries have a similar problem and have managed it rather better. So in that sense, I think we're just going to have to face the fact that it has to change. If we do get a deal, which is hugely significant if we do, then by all means try and do it in such a way that it is less likely to provide any kind of aid to Putin to carry on with this sort of attempt to create the greater Russia.
And Zelensky has said that if any deal is sort of agreed between Russia and the United States without the presence of the Ukrainians, Ukraine won't recognize it. Is that something that is within his choice? You know, if he sort of says, well, I don't like this deal, which the Americans and the Russians have signed, can he reject it? Or is he sort of completely subject to the whims now of Trump and Putin?
I think legally he may well be able to reject it, but whether he can in practice is a different matter. And this is where we are in very uncertain times in terms of the way that Trump himself is behaving. He believes now that things can be done more or less by him, for him, and that international agreements, and more particularly international norms, do not necessarily apply. So to that extent, I think in practice, the reality is that Zelensky would not get very far in those circumstances if you actually found that there was some sort of deal done, if you like, from his point of view, behind his back. One way or another, that would probably have to be accepted by him. But that depends very much on how negotiations are reached, how they're achieved, and whether, in fact, Trump, to some extent, or the people around Trump, back down a little bit. One has to remember that, Trump has had his failures as well, particularly the mistakes made over Afghanistan at the end of his first term of office. And the assumption is that, he can more or less get the deal he wants. I'm not sure about that. And essentially, we're going to just have to wait and see on it. But for the moment, the reality is that where we are now, Zelensky is in a position of weakness to some extent. The reality is that this war always had to end at the negotiating table. because neither side could afford to have a complete victory or risk a complete defeat. And this is where we are. And that does involve compromise. And that's been very difficult for the Ukrainians to accept. I agree. In fact, they're in a terrible position. But this is the reality of where we are because of mistakes made really quite a long way in the distant past.
Let's talk about broader security relations between Europe and the United States. Obviously, for about 80 years now, peace in Europe has basically been guaranteed by the Americans. People are reading the Munich conference last week, or especially J.D. Vance's speech on Friday, as a suggestion that the Americans are now saying, look, guys, you've got to defend yourselves. What do you make of this development? Does Europe need to start defending itself?
It depends very much on how you'd see the security threats that are facing us in the future. And, I take a different view to the majority, I suppose. Or maybe it's not, I don't know. The biggest single problem facing us faces every one of us, and that's climate breakdown. And we know that is starting to happen. It's going to accelerate. And that is a massive security threat, which involves a very different way of looking at security. I would certainly like to see the Europeans far more aware of that in trying to work out what they're going to do. You have another problem in the two significant European countries, Britain and France, each in their own way have this delusion of post-imperial grandeur, and they still think they are global powers. I mean, Britain has built these two giant aircraft carriers, the largest warships ever put into service in the Royal Navy. We can't crew them. We haven't got enough fleet auxiliaries to actually support them. But we've done it because we want to be a global power. And we retain nuclear weapons for the same reason. Essentially, those are, in a sense, anomalies in the case of both Britain and France in the European situation. In terms of Europe itself, one has to remember that in any kind of defensive scenario, there are all kinds of ways in which you can respond. And what is broadly known as defensive defense can be very effective as a deterrent. We're seeing now how a range of new small drones can basically wreck large, modern, heavily defended armor. And that is one of the things that has come out of the Ukraine war. So in a sense, I certainly like to see defense spending cut in Europe. I mean, British defense spending, it's extraordinary the position we're in. We've been part of coalitions that have been involved in three major failed wars in the last 25 years: Afghanistan, Iraq, and slightly more recently, Libya. And essentially, we don't even look at that. We forget about that. We don't even think what that means. We really got to work out what we're trying to defend and how, and what can be done by military means, and what basically can be done by other means, and look for those other means as well. One of the problems, I think, is we do live in this age of the military-industrial complexes, and that's not just Britain, that's Russia, China, India, the United States, France, Germany, and the rest, in which these are almost sort of self-perpetuating entities in their own right, very closely interconnected within the particular military-industrial complexes, very profitable, and essentially always able to say, we must defend ourselves. Anybody who basically criticizes what we're doing is in some way an appeaser of the enemy. We have to get over that and actually do some serious rethinking on what we mean by security and what is best for our security. I don't have the answers, but certainly we've got to do that. And currently, the defense review, which is underway, has ruled out many of the basic things to discuss. So, to my mind, it's going to be pretty largely pointless. But I come back to this theme: the biggest threat facing this situation, this world, in a sense, is what it is doing to itself in terms of climate breakdown as part of the problem of limits to growth. If we don't handle that, everything else, I think, will be rather pointless.
I mean, I suppose the political winds are blowing in the other direction at the moment. You've got sort of all the European governments competing to say who will increase defense spending the most. And as far as I gather, sort of the reason that they're pushing forward is to say, or that they're sort of saying this is really important, is to say that we can't rely on the Americans anymore. And we do need to be able to defend our eastern flank of our own accord. We don't want to be sort of dependent on the Americans anymore. And say, for example, Vladimir Putin or some subsequent leader of Russia wants to take out one of the Baltic states, for example. The Europeans want to be in a position where they can effectively deter that even without backup from the United States. To achieve that, would the Europeans need to spend more on defense? Or do you think that's kind of the wrong hypothetical scenario to be looking towards anyway?
I'm not sure that it's a viable scenario, but yes, we may have to face up to it. It doesn't mean we have to spend more on defense. It means we may have to configure what we're doing very differently. And essentially, if we're dealing with that sort of situation, how do you make it difficult for the Russians even to think about causing major problems? And that, I think, is not necessarily something where you have huge expenditure to go for. I gave you the example just now of the anti-armor systems which have become available and proven during the time of the Ukraine war. And essentially, I think it's that kind of thinking. It's a different kind of thinking outside of the box that you need to go for. I'm not saying that you don't need the kind of defenses that we might be used to, but to my mind, for a start, you've got to get over the incredible wastage we have in procurement and in research and development. We've got huge amounts of money which are being wasted there repeatedly in Britain and in most other countries. So for heaven's sake, we have to make things much leaner in that respect than we've done at the present time.
Finally, I know you're someone who thinks a lot about how conflicts can be avoided, how we can create an international architecture which is, more biased, that's the wrong word really to use, but sort of more prone to peaceful outcomes than conflictual ones. How have you looked at the first 3 or so weeks, almost a month now, of Donald Trump's second presidency? Are you reassured, impressed, concerned?
I think obviously concerned, probably I would guess like most people. What he is proving able to do by sort of, in a sense, throwing away the norms and the rules is actually very worrying and destabilizing. At the same time, exactly how far he can do it successfully is a very different matter. And I think this is where we haven't really got the full understanding of the makings of Trump. What we do have, though, and we have to remember this, is that behind Trump is a whole gaggle of particularly very, very wealthy people. The various billionaires are really very close to him. And this, I think, is one of the developments which we see really across much of the world. And that is, as we get these huge accretions of wealth among relatively few people, that gives them very considerable political power over conventional politicians. And that, I think, is a lesson not just for Trump, but it's true of other countries as well. I mean, you look at the way in which British politics is down so much to a relatively few people putting an awful lot of money into any of the major parties, particularly Labour Party now much more than previously, the Conservative Party, and indeed Reform as well. So that, I think, is happening as well, and that is happening in the United States. There may well be a reaction to this because, of course, if you find that all these things that Trump has been saying start to be proven not to work, and we're already starting to see that with inflation starting to rise in the United States, then this might be a relatively short period of real uncertainty and danger. I hope so. You can't be sure of it. But I think that is one thing to bear in mind if we are looking for crumbs of comfort in a rather difficult time.
So just to clarify, I mean, I think all of our audience will sort of accept immediately that sort of having a small group of people having this much political power, a small group of billionaires and incredibly wealthy people is terrible in terms of sort of like social justice and numerous reasons. Do you think it does make war more or less likely, though? Because, I mean, people look at someone like Elon Musk and they say, well, he's got business interests in China. He doesn't have the same sort of ideological predilections as the Biden team did about democracies versus autocracies. And you can perhaps look at sort of Donald Trump and his coterie of billionaires as being the ultimate realists, where they say, look, we don't actually want war. We want sort of strong trade relationships between these countries. Yeah, there might be trade tariffs, but they don't necessarily seem like the most hawkish bunch of people because they're just businessmen. I mean, do you think that there is a connection between having a small group of billionaires in power and warmongering? Or do you think that the current situation in Washington, while it's got loads and loads of terrible downsides, an upside could be a sort of softening of great power conflict?
It's possible, but I would rather doubt that at the present time. I mean, in a sense, it's very much a business deal to clear the Palestinians out of Gaza and build a new sort of Mediterranean ideal place on the sea, a resort on the sea. That, in a sense, is good business. It is not good politics, and it is not good human relations. So I'm really cautious about that as a possibility. I prefer actually people to being slightly more accountable than what we're suggesting, because basically you're talking about people who are completely non-accountable. And whether you like it or not, bureaucrats who support political systems are often pretty competent. And what we're finding, I think, with what Trump is doing, particularly with Musk and what Musk is allowed to be doing, they're having to chop and change what he does because he keeps on getting it wrong. So I'm not absolutely sure that having very wealthy people means you're going to have a more smoothly run and peaceful society.
That was Paul Rogers speaking to me earlier today. I'm going to say it. If you like our show, then please do consider becoming a financial supporter of Novara Media. If you're already a donor, you are what makes this possible. We're not funded by billionaires. We're funded by you guys. If you are already a subscriber, thank you so much. If not, go to novaramedia.com/support, donate whatever you can afford. A monthly donation is preferred, though one-offs are also brilliant. We want to build a new studio so I can get my co-hosts in the studio with me. And when actually we have these expert guests, we can tell them to come visit the studio instead of talk to us on Zoom, which I think will be a more enjoyable experience, both for me and I hope you as well. There have been countless stories of Israeli depravity in their 15-month genocidal war on Gaza, but this is up there as among the most shocking. In the Israeli 972 magazine, it's reported that last May, Israeli soldiers used an 80-year-old man as a human shield and then killed him. The report is based on testimony from Israeli soldiers who were present when all of this happened. They told Israeli investigative outlet The Hottest Place in Hell that soldiers in Gaza City came across an elderly couple in Gaza City in May who told them they had been unable to move south due to mobility issues. So in this case, the man had to use a cane to walk. I mean, you've seen all those scenes of people sort of walking with all their stuff from north to south Gaza. Obviously, it's very difficult if you're 80 and you have a stick. Now, this is what happened next. At that stage, the commander decided to use them as mosquitoes, one soldier explained, referring to a recently exposed procedure by which the army forces Palestinian civilians in combat zones to serve as human shields to protect soldiers from being shot or blown up. Several soldiers detained the woman at her house, while the man, using his cane, was made to walk ahead of the brigade soldiers. He entered each house before us so that if there were explosives or a militant inside, he would take the hit instead of us, one soldier explained. So this is, I'm going to give you some more details in a moment, but let's just be clear. This is Gazan people, Palestinians, being treated by Israel, not being treated, being used explicitly as human shields. Now, you'll remember at the start of the genocidal war, back in October, November, December of 2023, we would hear endlessly that the reason why so many civilians were being killed in this war is because Hamas used Palestinians as human shields. Now, what they meant when they said that is that Hamas has its sort of military infrastructure in urban areas. Now, that's probably true, right? But this is a much more explicit use of people as human shields. Because obviously, if you're fighting a guerrilla war, your military sort of equipment is generally going to be where people live, right? I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying that's quite normal, right? If you're fighting a guerrilla war, then your military infrastructure is going to be embedded in sort of civilian populations. That's how it worked in Algeria, how it worked in Vietnam, how it worked in Gaza. But using people explicitly as human shields is in finding a civilian and then getting them to walk in front of soldiers to stop the soldiers being attacked. That's much more explicit. Right? That's much more intentional in a way. And this story gets worse. According to one of the soldiers, before starting the sweep, an officer took a detonation cord, an explosive fuse attached to connect charges and explosives, attached it to an initiating charge, and tied it around the elderly man's neck so he wouldn't run away, even though he was walking with a cane. He was told that if he did anything wrong or didn't follow orders, the soldier behind him would pull the cord and his head would be torn from his body. After 8 hours like this, the soldiers brought the elderly man back to his home and ordered him and his wife to evacuate on foot towards the humanitarian zone in southern Gaza. According to the testimonies, the soldiers did not inform the nearby forces from different divisions that an elderly couple was about to cross through the area. After 100 meters, the other battalion saw them and immediately shot them, a soldier said. They died like that in the street. Now, so many parts of this story, so shocking. How dehumanizing it is. You're seeing these people not as humans, clearly, if you're tying sort of detonation devices around an old man's neck so that he can't run away when you're getting him to walk in front of you so that your soldiers don't get shot, right? Using him very explicitly as a human shield. And then because they didn't tell, the other sort of troops that these people were then going to try and go to southern Gaza, they immediately get killed. Now, you might think, do Israeli soldiers really need to be informed that there are civilians around to not shoot dead an elderly couple? But apparently not. If you're an elderly couple walking around in Gaza in May, you get shot dead. And if you're alive, you might get used as a human shield. Right? This is what our government was supporting for all this time. And of course, this incident was back in May. Thankfully, the ceasefire held this weekend. So coming up to the present day, meaning the people of Gaza will be spared an immediate return to full-blown war in situations like this. Their lives, though, are still being devastated by Israeli actions. You'll remember when Hamas threatened to stop releasing hostages last week. They cited Israel continuing to block temporary housing, heavy machinery to clear rubble, fuel, and other humanitarian aid from entering Gaza. Those hostages were ultimately released, and Palestinian captives were exchanged as well. But Al Jazeera reports that Israel is continuing to block the entry of mobile homes and tents into Gaza. So last week, Egyptian state TV broadcast footage of trucks loaded with temporary container houses lined up for inspection at the Rafah crossing. Yet as of today, not a single temporary house has been allowed to enter Gaza, and only 20,000 of the agreed 200,000 tents have been allowed in. Israel has also continued to destroy houses in Gaza since the ceasefire came into effect. Satellite footage shows that between the 19th of January and the 1st of February, Israel demolished and bulldozed 64 buildings in the city of Rafah. So this is after the ceasefire was agreed. They're still destroying houses. Of course, before the ceasefire was agreed, Israel had already destroyed or damaged the majority of buildings in Gaza. And by the time it came into effect, over 50,000 people had been killed, many of them women, many of them children. And today the BBC has released a new TV documentary showing the genocidal war on Gaza through the eyes of 3 children. The program is called Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone. It's available on iPlayer now. The film focuses on the daily lives of an 11-year-old Zakaria, a 10-year-old Renad, and a 13-year-old named Abdullah. It's Abdullah who features in the following clip.
Right here used to be my grandfather's house. About 40 people were here, including me and my family, for a few months.
Warplanes dropped massive bombs here. We'd already been displaced 4 times when this happened.
Whoops. Oh. It will take years to rebuild Gaza. This area used to be colorful. Now it's gray, just gray. People are leaving the eastern areas of Khan Yunis. Again,
3 miles away, the Israeli army have announced an evacuation order. They're looking for Hamas and its leader, Yahya Sinwar. When the Israeli army call an evacuation order, you have to leave fast, or it can be deadly.
ايش بصير؟ زي ما انت شايف يا اخي ايش بصير؟ فجأة في دقائق يلا امشوا في دقائق حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل في العرب. ايش اللي بصير؟ خشوا علينا اليهود.
So that's documentary footage from while the war was still going on. I mean, the thing it just makes me think about is, you've got all these destroyed houses. So you're going back to rubble, essentially where your home used to be. And I mean, if anyone who survived that situation you just see is going to have quite severe PTSD. You're going to have be incredibly sort of mentally distressed. You have no home. And I suppose the other thing that this makes me think about is when we keep hearing sort of Donald Trump say, well, of course they'll want to leave. It's a dump, it's a demolition site. Then that is actively incentivizing really Israel to not let in any mobile homes, right? Because the whole argument is the reason we should let them, or sort of quote, the reason we should let them, which is code for force them to leave to another country, is because they have a terrible standard of living. So Israel is being sort of actively incentivized. Not that they needed any incentive, but sort of what Trump is saying is providing the logic to make their lives as terrible as possible to justify the ethnic cleansing that he wants to facilitate. Ash, a number of things to sort of talk about here. I mean, what stands out to you from sort of some of these elements of what's going on in Gaza and what has gone on in Gaza over the past year?
I think the first thing to talk about is your description of just the most gratuitously cruel and malevolent war crime of forcing an 80-year-old man to walk with explosives tied around his neck. That kind of story would be familiar to many people around the world who've experienced colonial occupation. Many people who were subject to colonial occupation and ethnic cleansing would describe acts of the most gratuitous cruelty, dehumanization, and psychological warfare, because that's a part of what colonial oppressors do. So the idea that this is, a form of asymmetric warfare, I think it crumbles when you look at how the IDF actually conduct themselves. When you hear about a story like that, which, as you pointed out, and I think it's worth repeating, has been reported by IDF soldiers, right? Palestinians have been talking about the myriad cruelties they've experienced for years. It hardly gets any media coverage. Even this story is not being covered by the likes of, the BBC or the New York Times or CNN. And it's coming from the horse's mouth. Palestinians have been talking about this for years. They're not considered by much of the media establishment to be a reliable source of information. But even when it comes from IDF soldiers themselves, there is something of a conspiracy of silence. There is a veil of silence being drawn around it because it undermines the idea of Israel being, a lawful or legitimate actor. It undermines the sort of both sidesism. Now, had that been a report of, something that a Hamas fighter did during October 7th, or something that Hamas fighters did, during the war since October 7th, guarantee it would be all over the news. The same as when we look at the condition of Palestinian captives when they're being released from Israeli detention, when they are emaciated, when they are released with fewer limbs than they went in with, when they are showing signs of torture, of beatings. It hardly causes a ripple. When you see signs of starvation, trauma amongst Israeli hostages, then not only does it dominate the news agenda, it has this power to shape the political agenda as well. There is... I know that I've said this an awful lot in the past year, but I think one of the things that causes me the deepest and most profound shame as a British citizen and someone who is also a journalist is that our government, our media, is complicit in Israel's project of dehumanizing the Palestinian people. And we're complicit in it through nearly every aspect of our media coverage and, nearly every element of our political consensus.
Donald Trump was helped to power by broy podcasters, and he intends to pay them back. And in the case of the most objectionable influencers of all, that includes trying to secure their freedom. Now, Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan and were arrested in Romania in 2022 and charged with human trafficking, sexual misconduct, and money laundering, as well as starting an organised crime group. Quite the set of allegations. The pair have denied any wrongdoing, but they are awaiting trial in Romania and are currently banned from leaving the country. But the Trump administration thinks they deserve a holiday. This is from the FT. The Tate's case was first brought up by US officials in a phone call with the Romanian government last week, and then followed up by Trump's special envoy, Richard Grenell, when he met the Romanian foreign minister at the Munich Security Conference. That's according to Free People familiar with the matter. A fourth person said a request was made to return the brothers' passports and allow them to travel while they wait for court proceedings to conclude. I'm not a judge, right? But if you were to give those two guys passports, you really think they're going to go back to Romania to face those charges, right? They're going to go straight to Florida, camp out at Mar-a-Lago for the next 4 years, right? It's sort of appreciate all the praise of the most important man in the world, Donald Trump. They're not going to say, okay, fine, yeah, we're going to come back to Romania to face our charges for trafficking. You can see why they're not giving them the passports back. Anyway, Richard Grenell, he's the guy involved here. He is a former diplomat, of course, because he's in the Trump administration. He's a former Fox News contributor. He's got 1.7 million followers on X. He denied having a substantive conversation with the Romanian foreign minister in Munich, but he did say he is a supporter of the Tate brothers. Tristan Tate has recently weighed into the debate about cutting funding for USAID. And earlier this month, he tweeted this. I wonder if any USAID went to Romania to fund any particular lawfare-based investigation, sort of saying they were funding the trial against them. And Richard Grenell, sort of quite a long conversation sort of ensues, but then Richard Grenell intervened saying the USAID programs were weaponized against people and politicians who weren't woke. The Biden team spent US taxpayer money to support left-wing programs and candidates around the world. Conservatives around the world were targeted. Romania is the latest example. Ash, Donald Trump, I suppose they made their big thing, DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. We shouldn't have officials wasting their time on stuff that isn't that important. And, the number one priority of the State Department now seems to be how do we get podcasters off alleged sex crimes?
Well, that's the thing, is that Doge was never about cutting government waste. I mean, at the same time that Doge has been taking, a hatchet to government spending, the US government has signed a massive contract with Tesla for the production or the provision of armored vehicles. I mean, Elon Musk is a parasite who's grown grotesquely fat off of the US taxpayers' teat. I mean, billions and billions of dollars worth of investment for both Tesla and SpaceX. Now he's inveigled himself to the heart of government. He's not going to stop serving his own interests. And Doge, I think, has had a sort of shock doctrine effect on the US government. So you go in, you initiate a crisis, which is this, massive, indiscriminate bonfire of US aid spending in other departments. And then you use that shock to make those governments serve your political purposes, which in this case is securing the freedom of two guys who talk really, really weirdly and who've been accused of sex trafficking. Now, of course, both Tristan and Andrew Tate vociferously deny the allegations made against them. But there are plenty of comments on the public record which could make you think there's plausible grounds for suspicion here. When they talk about the methods used to wear away the psychological defenses of women to make them do your bidding, you can see why someone would think, all right, you might have been, using this to facilitate a sex trafficking operation. The fact that they've got a large enough following of people who are primed to believe that anything that they dislike as a product of conspiracy is deeply worrying. I mean, there are so many ways in which you can look at the story. Like, one's obviously through the lens of Elon Musk and Doge and this sort of, self-serving shock doctrine that he's, helping to initiate. The other is the creation of these hermetically sealed information universes where you've got millions and millions of people who are, drawn into somebody's orbit and who will not consider for a second that there might be probable cause for the things that they're being accused of. I mean, I think that's the thing that's worrying, because it's going to play out again and again and again, whether it's, Andrew Tate or, Russell Brand or anybody else. The fact that there are these cults of personality around these men who, deny the accusations against them, but have publicly behaved in ways which are certainly cause for intense disquiet. I think that's the thing which perhaps worries me most.
Yeah, I mean, if the term red flag applies to anyone, it definitely applies to the Tate brothers, right? Stephen Meffan in the comments, maybe time to acknowledge that the Tates have done an excellent job at recruiting potential foot soldiers for whatever comes next, I suppose, by being so obnoxious. Now, I should say, Stephen Meffan, researcher, editor, sometimes host, sometimes guest, is supposed to be on a writing retreat, not on the internet. But I'm glad you couldn't stay away
writing. Commenting
from your
is
family
writing.
here at Novara Media. That is true. That is a form of writing. He's keeping himself fresh. Luigi Mangione's defense fund has raised over $300,000 from more than 10,000 donors. And the man suspected of assassinating United Healthcare boss Brian Thompson has now released a thank you statement online. So he says, "I am overwhelmed by and grateful for everyone who has written to me to share their stories and express their support. Powerfully, this support has transcended political, racial, and even class divisions as mail has flooded MDC, I presume that's the prison he's in, from across the country and around the globe. While it is impossible for me to reply to most letters, please know that I read every one that I receive. Thank you again to everyone who took the time to write. I look forward to hearing more in the future." So he's getting so many letters, he can't possibly reply to all of them. The amount of support that Mangione is receiving also means the prosecution are worried about the makeup of the jury when he does go to trial.
Prosecutors may face an uphill task preventing secret supporters of Luigi Mangione from getting on the jury at his trial.
They're going to want to make sure that they don't have people on this jury who are particularly sympathetic to Luigi Mangione, who maybe won't even focus on the evidence as much as his plight.
ABC News chief legal analyst Dan Abrams says the Mangione case is not open and shut, despite the overwhelming evidence.
Guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
A lot of people are supporting him.
He has enormous support. I haven't quite seen this kind of support for someone who isn't famous.
I mean, he's definitely famous now, right? This will be, of course, very shocking to the American establishment. A young man who was filmed, maybe I should say allegedly filmed, I don't know, but it was a film of someone who looked like him shooting a health insurance boss in broad daylight, is so popular, he might not be found guilty in court. Right? That's what that sort of analyst was suggesting. The buzz around Mangione also doesn't appear like it will dissipate anytime soon.
A new investigation Discovery Channel documentary, Who is Luigi Mangione? Pieces together Mangione's decline from high school valedictorian to accused assassin. Abrams is executive producer and says Mangione and his alleged victim actually had a lot in common.
They were both very smart.
Yeah.
They were both overachievers. They were both valedictorians. They were both the people who folks in their community thought were going to be stars, and their lives intersected in a way that no one would have imagined.
I mean, there's a lot to say here about, the US health insurance system and how, people have been harmed by it, and that's sort of why there's so much sympathy for this. But I mean, the first thing that I thought of actually with all of this is like in the UK. So when it comes to sort of like a criminal case in the UK, as soon as someone is charged, you are not allowed to. I mean, you are allowed to utter their name, but you're not allowed to do much more than utter their name. You say anything that could possibly influence anyone to see if they were, or to suggest if they were guilty or innocent, blah, 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 blah. You can be in contempt of court, one of the sort of the most serious things that a journalist could do wrong, because you can end up in prison. In America, you've got like an active case, and you can have this really, I mean, was he at NBC or ABC? I don't know, this sort of powerful analyst, like producing this documentary where they say their lives intersected in a way which no one had imagined. How could anyone have imagined it? It's like they're both very high achievers. One of them a boss. One of them shot in the back of the head. One of them angry at US healthcare. It's very Netflix already, isn't it, Ash?
It absolutely is Netflix. I mean, it's one thing which makes me grateful for the UK's reporting restrictions, because there is no way a media organisation would be able to make that kind of documentary ahead of trial, because it could be considered prejudicial. And I think that that's right. I mean, of course, there are some reporting restrictions in the United States. You have to supply all of your allegedlys, and of course, they deny all accusations and rare. But like the entire system around the reporting of court trials is so much more sensationalist and treats it as a form of reality television, which I think is just deeply, deeply unhealthy. I did want to talk about the particular way in which jury selection plays out in the United States, because it is different from the system that we've got here in the UK. So in the US, the defense and the prosecution can move to strike people from the juror pool and to exclude them based on things where they say, okay, but you're going to be biased. And in the case of, Luigi Mangione, it might be the case that the prosecution says, okay, well, have you had an experience which is negative with health insurance? Were you denied coverage? Were you overcharged? Were you excluded from coverage because of a pre-existing condition? Well, we can't trust you to be non-biased or non-prejudiced in this case. That's going to include an awful lot of people. I mean, part of the reason why the Luigi Mangione case has captured people's attention so much and I think tapped into a latent sense of, well, I don't condone murder, but is because of just how universally terrible the experience of healthcare insurance is for people. Like the quality of care you get once you've got the healthcare insurance, good. Everything leading up to that, the amount of admin, all the pretexts people use to kick you off of your health insurance, absolutely awful. As far as I know, when it comes to restricting the grounds on which you can exclude a juror, the only thing I know in the US case, and maybe one of our very intelligent audience members can correct me, is that you are prevented from committing what's called a Batson violation. So it was ruled by the Supreme Court that you cannot exclude jurors on the basis of race. As you can imagine, Batson violations still occur, but are coded, shall we say? Have you had a negative experience of police, that kind of thing. I don't think that excluding people on the basis of having a negative experience of healthcare insurers would count as a violation of due process.
Obviously, my mind's always in the gutter, so I'm just imagining the defense lawyer or the prosecution, wouldn't it be, saying like, I want to exclude juror 4 because I have here a screenshot of them replying hubba hubba to the first picture released of Luigi Mangione. Juror number 6 always dates men with bushy eyebrows. Something's going on there. This person cannot be a fair juror in this case.
This is why they didn't want you in the jury for the Daniel Khalif case, Michael.
I know. I would have had to have recused myself, I suppose. Big thank you to Margaret Conaghan for donating £100 via novaramedia.com as we were live. We're going to stop. Well, I mean, we do still like super chats, but super chats, Google takes such a big cut of it. When you go directly to novaramedia.com, we get nearly all of it. I think, the payment system gets 5% or something like that. But Google takes, I think, a third. It's crazy. That's techno-feudalism for you, isn't it? Right? You're every third hour we work, we're actually working for Google, not ourselves. If it's based on what's going on YouTube. But if you go directly to novaramedia.com/support, we get nearly all of it. And that means we can pay our staff. That means we can build our new studio. We can cover our backs legally if we want to cover anything risky. So thank you so much, Margaret. If you haven't already, I'll say again, do go to novaramedia.com/support. We really do appreciate it. A new tell-all interview with James Murdoch, that's the younger son of billionaire media mogul Rupert Murdoch, and for a period, his heir apparent, has been making waves. Published in The Atlantic, the piece is called Growing Up Murdoch, and it promised mind games, sibling rivalry, and a war for the family media empire, and it delivers on those promises. So the article is incredibly reminiscent of a real-life version of Succession, the HBO series, which was, of course, based on the Murdochs. It focuses on the battle over the inheritance of News Corp. Do you say News Corp or News Corp? I'm not sure. Anyway, the piece explains that Murdoch's ex-wife, Anna Torv, mother of 3 of his 4 adult children, had negotiated for the trust to be split equally between the 4 of them. She disliked Rupert's tendency to play his offspring against each other, so maybe not as much of a sociopath as the mother in Succession. But anyway, particularly James and his brother Lachlan. She was upset that he was always playing them off. Here's the 3 of them. So James, Lachlan and Rupert, you can see there. They're at a Beverly Hills charity gala in 1998. So as you've got, I think a charity gala often sort of attracts some of the most evil people in the world. I think that's kind of how the guest lists work. Anyway, James suggests that because his father is a misogynist, neither of his sisters, Prudence or Elizabeth, were ever considered serious contenders to become his heir. So that's why it was down to James and Lachlan. However, in 2024, Rupert tried to override the wishes of the mother of 3 of his children, and he told James and his sisters that he was rewriting the family trust to grant Lachlan full control of the Murdoch empire after his death. Now, even the fictional Rupert Murdoch didn't try this. This was too far, even for that one. This was part of a secret plan he and his confidants had codenamed, and perhaps ironically, this is really good, Project Family Harmony. The legal fight played out away from the public eye in Nevada probate court. Here's Rupert Murdoch arriving at that court with his 5th wife, Elena Zukova.
Mr. Murdoch, are you confident of victory?
Are there any ongoing settlement talks?
Any comment, Mr. Murdoch? Why the secrecy in the case?
I think he's had 3 more wives than Logan Roy. In December 2024, Rupert lost that case and failed to hand everything to Lachlan. While much of this will, of course, be familiar to anyone who's followed news about the Murdoch family, the piece also contains lots of juicy new details, and James gives a fresh perspective on previously reported events. As I say, all very, very reminiscent of Succession. What I'm about to read, I just imagine it as a scene on the HBO show. 100%. They wouldn't even need to do any modifications. You should also watch Succession, by the way, if you haven't already. Let's go to an extract from the Atlantic article. This is about a family counselling retreat Rupert Murdoch invited his children to attend in 2010. So they say, the retreat was held at the Murdoch family's ancestral ranch in, who doesn't have an ancestral ranch? Ancestral ranch in Carvin Station, a 25,000-acre farm a few hundred miles from Sydney, where merino sheep roam the plains and kangaroos have to be culled. The purpose was not ostensibly to discuss succession planning, James recalled, but rather how they would behave with each other. Was this more business or personal, I asked. There's no difference in this family, he said. So it goes on. Lately, Rupert had been talking with Liz about acquiring her production company, Shine Group. James didn't think his sister would sell. She'd turned Shine, which produced mega hits such as The Biggest Loser and MasterChef, into a success all by herself. Why let her father get his claws in it? My father was always trying to pull everyone into the company so that he could manipulate them against each other, James told me. The therapist began by sitting down with each Murdoch individually to get their view of what was wrong with the family. James, skeptical of the exercise, remembers telling him, there's some stuff you don't need to pick at. Nothing good is going to come of it. Sure enough, when the therapist convened the family, the session devolved into posturing, gaslighting, and recriminations. Everybody was spinning stories to garner strategic sympathy and advance their own agenda, James and Catherine told me. I think that the shrink was outmatched, Catherine said. It was a car crash, James said. Everyone was more alienated from each other at the end. Then it goes on. Not long after that weekend, a mention of the Murdoch's family therapy made it into Vanity Fair. Whoever leaked the story described a loving, supportive experience. James's siblings advocated for their little brother, eager to help him strengthen his relationship with their father so that he'd be ready to take over the business one day. When I read this account to James, He scoffed. This is the last bit I'm going to read you. The family trust litigation had recently led him to some very different conclusions about the purpose of that strange retreat. His siblings, he'd come to believe, had grown irritated by his successful run at News Corps. Perhaps watching their little brother strut around like a boy king, unsupervised by the king himself, had bred resentment. In any case, he believed, they'd been agitating for Rupert to rein in James. The family counselling was, James now believed, primarily an effort to get control of him. Ash, I don't know if you watch Succession, but this is just 100% to a T what the show is like, right? A family therapy session, which is actually just all in the power struggle over the company. It's all political. It's all instrumental. Every single conversation, every relationship, however profound it might seem at the time, is all trying to, get more control, a means to an end. I know you've read the article. What did you make of it?
It is an extraordinary article, and I encourage everybody to read it. That doesn't mean that it is infallible, and there are certain things which are delicately left out, and I'm going to get to them in a second. But it really is a fascinating article. And if you ever need a little bit of comfort when you're thinking about your own dysfunctional family relationships, just be grateful that you didn't grow up a Murdoch. It's not just that the Murdochs resemble the Logan Roy clan from Succession. One of the really fascinating details from this piece is that the Murdochs were themselves profoundly shaped by the storylines that they were watching on Succession. They were gripped by paranoia that people from within the inner circle were leaking information to Jesse Armstrong, the Succession showrunner. And Jesse Armstrong has said, no one was leaking. I just got everything from, things that had already been put into the public sphere. So you had leaked, but you hadn't leaked it to me. And apparently, this is according to James Murdoch, every time, Succession was airing, it would initiate new rounds of backstabbing and maneuvers amongst the Murdochs because there was something about this television program which made them feel so exposed that it sort of stimulated them into action as they tried to get hold of the family empire. Now, it's a great piece. I think that it's a very revealing piece. What I would say is that it's limited by its own access. So the fact that this journalist gets so much access to James Murdoch and his wife, Catherine, I think means that he can't see the wood for the trees sometimes. So there's an extended section about the phone hacking scandal. And basically how James Murdoch feels is that he was hung out to dry, used as a scapegoat by his own father to protect Rebecca Brooks. But the journalist himself says that, he can be quite vague about some of these details. He doesn't want to get drawn in. And at first the journalist is wondering, well, why? Your father hung you out to dry. Oh, is it because you're protecting him? And then let me just read you a paragraph very quickly. I want to press him on this point to suggest that it might not actually be normal for your father to conspire to destroy your career and place you in legal jeopardy in order to give your job to your older brother. But James surely knew all this. Maybe he just didn't want to dwell on his father's cruelty or the fact he'd never been the favourite. James wasn't protecting Rupert, I realised. He was protecting himself. And I read this and I was like, sure. Or maybe the reason why he won't be drawn in is because it's one thing to put a very negative story about your father into the public sphere. It's enough to say that is another thing to say that he was criminally culpable. It's, there might be implications that James Murdoch knew more than he was letting on about the phone hacking activities at the Sun and the News of the World. There are all sorts of reasons why James Murdoch might not want to be drawn too deeply into talking about who knew what when it came to phone hacking. And his own psychological fragility is just one of those reasons, right? There are other interests at play. Similarly, something which is missing from this piece is that James Murdoch is quite happy lobbing grenades and calling his father a misogynist, shedding light on this, what seems like a genuinely distressing game of favoritism and backstabbing amongst the Murdoch siblings. What he declines to talk about is the fact that one thing which united the adult Murdoch siblings, so Prue, Elizabeth, James, and Lachlan, is that they didn't want Rupert Murdoch's children with his, I can't remember if it was second or third wife, Wendy Deng, didn't want those children to be given voting rights or control. So while they'll be beneficiaries of the stock, they are going to be richer probably than our entire audience combined. So, no need to feel too sorry for them. They will never inherit the empire. So, James Murdoch's quite happy to cast his father as a misogynist when he's talking about the fact that neither Prue nor Elizabeth were considered serious contenders for the Murdoch empire. Why is it that Wendy Deng's children, who I believe are both daughters, were excluded from voting rights? Don't know. No mention of that is made. So this is the thing about a piece like this, is that it is fascinating. It is packed full of detail. It is absolutely delicious, and you should read it, but take it with a grain of salt and think about all the things that are missing. This is a piece which is a salvo in James's war against his own family. That's not quite the same as the entire truth.
Not the entire truth. You've got to write account. You've got to go interview Lachlan and get his side of the story, Ash. I think that's the only that'd be the only fair thing to do now. Lachlan, if you want to get in touch, I think that'd be a great video. Let's make that happen.
Call me boo.
Before we go, thanks to Joseph, Timothy, Rita, and Mira for their donations on novaramedia.com. Really, really do appreciate it. This is so much better than asking for super chats. I feel very, very pleased with all of this. Thank you so much. Thank you for your support. And if you are already a donor, thank you so much. If you're not, novaramedia.com/support. We really, really do appreciate it. Ash, I really, really do appreciate you. I'm going to miss you.
I appreciate you too. I'm going to miss you. I'm going to miss you. But,
I was going to say, I'm even more upset that you're still doing it. You're like, don't worry, I might not be doing Novara Live, but I'm doing If I Speak, I'm doing everything. I'm like, that makes it even worse. Right? If you were just gone, I wouldn't mind. But you're like, well, I can do everything else, just Novara Live. I mean, I'd prefer to do the book stuff. Anyway.
Well, you know what? There's no need to be bitter about it. No need to be bitter. This is why I need a break. I need a break from us. I need a break from us.
Yeah, well, I hope you come back refreshed, right? Because, this is getting difficult for me too. By the way, I finished your book over the weekend. Fantastic. 100% recommend it. Really, really interesting. And of course, if you want a preview to the book, you can check out Ash Sarkar being interviewed by Aaron Bastani on Downstream yesterday. Have to admit, I haven't watched this yet. I'm going to listen to it in podcast form, I think, on my way home this evening. Can't wait. Ash, good luck with your book launch. Very, very exciting stuff. Pleasure speaking to you this evening.
Right. See you all in a month. I cannot wait to come back.
And we'll see you all tomorrow. Well, I won't. I'll see you on Wednesday. But Novara Media, Novara Live will be available for you tomorrow at 6 p.m. Aaron Bastani will be hosting. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.